Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first lesson for the Philosophy Academy on the topic of political philosophy. In this video, what we're going to do is ask the question, what is political philosophy and why is it so important, before outlining the scope of this series of lessons going forward. Now, as an important point, I would like to reference everybody the image that I decided to choose for the representation of political philosophy. I could have put a picture of Parliament, or I could have put a picture of Congress, or some kind of protest, but I decided to have a painting of what is the Declaration of Independence, because one of the major elements of political philosophy is the ideology of liberalism that we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on at the start of this series. And some of the most foundational principles of liberalism ended up being enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And so it really is an indication, a representation of how political philosophy, the writings of political philosophy, actually can shape the fundamental future of one of, if not at the moment, the most powerful state on earth. So it shows that it is a very, very, very important topic, and I thought that this painting is a nice representation of why it is so important. So we're going to ask the following questions. We're going to ask the question, what is political philosophy? Why should one care about politics or political engagement from the philosophical perspective? How can one unpack the moral dimensions of political decisions? And what even is politics? What do we even mean when we talk about politics in this regard? Those are all the questions for this series of videos. And all of these questions fall under the banner of political philosophy, and it is arguably, as cited here, one of the most diverse fields of philosophy that one can study. You fundamentally have the point that all questions of politics can be scrutinized from a political perspective and from a philosophical perspective, to the point where any question of politics is a question of philosophy. That is one of the things that has been cited as a reason for why political philosophy is so important. The philosophy of politics is something that people don't necessarily engage with on a regular basis. Fundamentally talking about the theoretical and philosophical foundations for political beliefs and why one should have a political belief, what ought to be the case, how things ought to be applied, the normative versus the descriptive in relation to political philosophy. All of which are very, very important, arguably the most important part of philosophy, in the sense that they apply directly to the day-to-day lives of policymakers and the day-to-day lives of every single person around the world to this day. People are exposed to political philosophy when they have to be. Okay, so let's think of an example. In the United Kingdom in 2016, there was a vote, a referendum, on whether or not the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. More colloquially, this is known as Brexit, and it went about as well as we all expected it would. The decision is a decision about policy, i.e., what direction should the United Kingdom go vis-à-vis its relationship with Europe? Should it leave the European Union? Should it stay as a member of the European Union? This is a policy question that would have with it a number of important implications, the ways in which this could be achieved, what a post-Brexit relationship would look like with the European Union. Does European Union law apply in the United Kingdom anymore? What about European Union law that existed and has been implemented by the United Kingdom for many, many years? What about Euratom, the European Union's atomic agency? Do we leave that as well as the European Union? All of these are policy questions. These are sort of the brass tacks, the actual meat of the issue. But fundamentally, at its core, these are questions, and this is a debate about political philosophy. It is a philosophical question, because what underlies all of these policy questions and all of these policy perspectives are fundamental theoretical questions, i.e., should the European Union be able to limit the legislative sovereignty of the United Kingdom? Is the issue of sovereignty of UK political systems something that is far more important than the perceived economic efficiency and economic benefits that are had with the limitation of sovereignty and the membership of the European Union? Do the economic benefits more broadly outweigh its drawbacks? This is also a question fundamentally, as was unfortunately the case in the referendum itself. It became a debate about immigration. It became a debate about funding to the NHS, all of these different things. These are not only policy decisions, but they are also philosophical decisions, or at least they are policy decisions that have attached to them fundamental philosophical foundations. So the result of this is that we are thinking about political philosophy at the most fundamental level. It was a decision that was effectively a decision pertaining to policy, but was actually a deeply philosophical question. So one may be correct in suggesting that the political dimensions and the political beliefs are actually founded in our ethical and philosophical beliefs. Okay, you might think, for example, that that inequality, for example, is a fundamental evil. And so you might suggest that capitalism is evil as a result of that belief. That is a moral prescription. You're talking about morality at that point. You're suggesting that inequality is bad, it is immoral, and it should be avoided. And then you are also thinking about this from a normative perspective. You're suggesting that, well, inequality is bad. It ought to be stamped out. It ought to be removed. It ought to be replaced. It ought to be destroyed. Any kind of inequality. This is a normative question. It is telling us what things, how we ought to act and how we ought to behave. We ought to act. We ought to elect. We ought to implement policy that deals with and tries to reduce levels of inequality. You may believe as a result of that capitalism is a major problem of this. And so as a result of that, you may have the informed opinions from the basis of those fundamental philosophical decisions, okay? It will inform your political opinions. You may be a socialist as a result of the fact that you believe that capitalism is evil, or that you believe inequality is evil. You may therefore go about and start to vote and start to join political parties which align to your beliefs, and we go from, as we can see here, a fundamental philosophical and ethical belief in inequality being bad, all the way down to your day-to-day voting habits and voting behaviors. You might vote Labour, for example, not necessarily if you were a socialist, but you might vote Labour if you were somebody who believed in quite general liberal thoughts. If you were a communist, you might join a communist party, okay, or go about doing canvassing for a communist association. You might write letters and pamphlets for a communist newspaper. Equally, if you were a conservative, you might do the same thing. All of this is really talking about how we go from the day-to-day policy, the political decisions day-to-day, and we can realize and understand that these exist downstream from fundamental philosophical questions. And fundamentally, people come to the conclusion that political philosophy could just be described as a type of applied ethics. How we can take our ethical moral formulations and standards and we can apply them to day-to-day situations, okay? What should be done about homelessness? What ought to be done about taxation? Is it morally justified to have a situation where we have people who are struggling to pay the bills on the one hand and people who have more money that they can ever be able to spend on the other? These are all philosophical moral questions, but they inform your political prescriptions. You might argue for a wealth tax as a result of that moral prescription. Okay, you might argue for some kind of formulation of universal housing or sort of state subsidized housing for to try and tackle and reduce homelessness. All of which are again informed by your philosophical beliefs. This series will be dedicated to the subject of political philosophy. We'll begin by thinking about the idea of political ideologies and how these ideologies will impact decision making. Okay, the political ideologies that we're going to focus on in this series of lessons include the beginning with liberalism. We will then talk about conservatism. We'll talk about socialism and anarchism. Okay, and then we will finish by thinking about feminism at the end. How these inform our decisions, what kind of beliefs these have, what kind of variations within those beliefs there are. So the modern versus classical, for example, or anarchism or anarcho-capitalism, for example, two sort of broad and quite distinct theories within the broader context of anarchism, for example. We will then talk about how we can apply some of these issues and apply some of these decisions to actual issues in political philosophy. We'll talk about the issue of democracy. We can talk about the content of distributive justice, the idea of the state and the relationship between the people and the state, and then finally thinking about totalitarianism as a philosophical question and a philosophical discussion. This is not necessarily all of the issues in political philosophy that we're going to concern ourselves with. We might focus on some other things and some other elements. We might focus on some other ideologies as well. This is just the sort of basic skeleton view of what this series is going to involve. In fact, we're going to spend probably a lot of time thinking about lots of other different issues within political philosophy, like economic justice, for example. We might think about global justice, but from a quite holistic interpretation, given that I want to spend some time thinking about global justice in its own series. But all of these things are going to be for the future and for future lessons in this subject on political philosophy.